Well, I did it. I spent the last 5 weeks taking a road trip from coast to coast, from California back to the East Coast, visiting the grave sites of every single U.S. president. So I'll be sharing those with you over the next few weeks and months. There are actually 39 of them. Now, 2 of them are laid to rest in California, where I live, and so I visited them right before taking this road trip. So on this 5-week, 35-plus day bucket list road trip, I was able to visit the other 37 presidents who are buried all over the country. And I can tell you, the vast majority are not in convenient places. They're out in the middle of nowhere. They're in little tiny cemeteries that are very difficult to find. And on top of that, which I didn't realize when I started this trip, which is maybe a good thing, because if I knew, I might not have done this, at least half of them are privately owned, or they're owned by the state, by the government, and they're closed. They're closed 1, 2, 3 days a week. And even when they are open, sometimes the hours are extremely limited.
We're open Wednesday to Sunday from 9 to 12 and then from 1 to 4.
Okay. So he was just saying they close at 12 and open at 1, I guess for lunch. And I just happened to get here and walk through the mausoleum right before I just left, just as he was closing up. I'm glad I got here when I did. So it's made it a real challenge to be able to visit all of the grave sites, all of the U.S. President grave sites in 5 weeks. So just a heads up, in case you decide to take a road trip and visit all of the U.S. President grave sites too, allow yourself some extra time if you can, if you don't want to be stressed out. Because there were at least a couple of president grave sites where they were closed on the day I got there, and they were going to be closed for at least 2 days. So I had to wait around, or I had to drive hundreds of miles away to visit another presidential grave site and then drive all the way back, a couple of days later. So it really put on a lot more miles. I think I've put on close to 9,000 miles. Coast to coast, I think, is only around 3,000, so that'd be 6,000 round trip. But I had to do so many detours and backtracking and zigzagging just to find all of the grave sites. It added another 3,000 miles to my trip. So this trip was definitely a challenge. In addition to the president grave sites, I also visited other grave sites along the way, but I found visiting the presidential grave sites such a challenge, and there were so many obstacles to overcome. It didn't leave a lot of time to visit other grave sites. So I didn't visit as many grave sites as I was hoping to on this long 5-week road trip, but I did visit some pretty amazing grave sites. So I'll be sharing those with you over the next few weeks and months. And same with the presidential grave sites. And I think you're going to find them much more interesting than you might have expected. I sure did. These are some of the most over-the-top, extreme, grand, beautiful, spectacular, and often surprising grave sites that I've ever visited. And that was part of the reason I wanted to do this. I knew at least some of them were really over the top and really extreme compared to the grave sites I normally visit. And I know quite a few of you over the years have commented, and I've even commented that, well, when I visit famous grave sites, so many of them are so plain, so ordinary, so modest, it's hard to believe they were ever a famous person. And it's hard to believe they didn't want something a little bit more memorable as a final resting place. Well, I don't think you're going to be saying that about any of these presidential grave sites, except for maybe a couple. And those are interesting just because they are so different and modest compared to all of the rest of the presidential grave sites. In fact, there's one that really shocked me because it was so simple, so plain, just a presidential grave on the side of the road, really, in a cemetery that wasn't even gated. And you would never know that this was a final resting place of a president. I think that's interesting in itself, that a president would have such an unassuming final resting place when all of the others, most of the others, have anything but unassuming final resting places. Even though they're U.S. presidents, they still had lives just like the rest of us, and they had their trials and tribulations, they had their heartbreaks, they had their tragedies and triumphs, and some of them, the stories are just so weird and bizarre and almost unbelievable at times. Not exactly what I was expecting when I started visiting these presidential grave sites. Overall, it was an amazing trip, had a lot of highs, a lot of lows, a lot of obstacles, but it was definitely a trip of a lifetime to remember. But I'm curious, have any of you been to all of the presidential grave sites? If so, share with us in the comments section, and we'll start our own little club of grave hunters who have been to all of the presidential grave sites. So I know of one other person, Kurt Dion. He started visiting grave sites when he was very young, and I'll tell you a little bit more about him. In fact, I met him along the way, and we did a video, and I'll share that with you soon. And he's sort of the expert on presidential grave sites. So he helped me on this trip a lot he gave me a lot of advice, a lot of tips, a lot of interesting tidbits that I had no idea, and helped with things like just finding these places and parking and just very practical things. But the person who helped me the most was Jim, my daily virtual co-pilot and backup GPS, who made sure that I didn't end up lost in Mexico somewhere or sleeping in my car at night. He was especially helpful every afternoon, helping me find some of the best and cheapest hotels in every town that I visited. And it was just more fun having someone along for the ride, even if it was just virtually. Haven't had much time to be editing and uploading videos on this trip because they take me half a day to edit usually, even that 3-4 minute video. And the last thing I want to do on a road trip like this is spend my time in my hotel room editing videos. So a lot more videos will now be coming. Oh, and before I forget, I definitely want to give a shout out and a very big thank you to my very generous supporters, Dana Pretzer and Dan DeLynch. Thank you, Dana and Dan, for your continued support of this channel. It means a lot, as you know. And also thank you for all the funny comments and interesting comments and thoughtful comments you've left over the last number of years as well. That's always really appreciated as well. So thank you for your latest contributions, which have definitely come in handy on this road trip. So as I always say, till our next trip to the cemetery together, thanks for sharing the memories, everybody.